Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Anne Gagne. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm recording this today on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. I want to talk to you today about mentorship, and in particular, supporting the future of accessibility through mentorship and through connection, and how we can open up mentorship opportunities to some folk who haven't had that opportunity in the past. So, what is mentorship? This is one of the things that we're going to be talking about today. I want to, in particular, think about what accessible mentorship could look like, how to mentor accessibly, and then give you some next steps in terms of how you would want to do that too, if this is something that's interesting to you. I want to talk about mentorship because, as someone who does accessible pedagogy, I worry about the future of who will be doing accessible pedagogy in higher education spaces. How do we mentor the next generation of folk who do this work? And oftentimes, mentorship models, in the way that they are now and traditionally, exclude a whole bunch of people, like disabled people, those with chronic illness, because those mentorship models are really rigid and they don't allow for the kind of flexibility and accessibility that folk would need. So, what is mentorship? Well, mentorship, of course, is a relationship. It's about supporting and guiding others. It's about helping folk with tasks, skills, or even helping to connect folk to specific communities that they may be interested in, so like the accessibility or disability community. It's about introducing new concepts that they may not have been aware of. And it more often than not is about someone who has more experience or influence providing and supporting that for other folk. So if you have more experience or influence, how do you make that experience and influence something that's meaningful to someone else who wants to get into the field that you're in? So what does accessible mentorship look like? Well, accessible mentorship could be and should be inclusive. It's about meaningful communication. It's about meaningful guidance. And ultimately, it starts with a conversation about what mentorship models work best for those involved. And the way that you mentor one person may be completely different than the way that you mentor someone else, because those relationships are important. That communication is important. How does that person want to be mentored? How do they want that communication to happen? That may be different for each person. And so accessible mentorship thinks about that flexibility, thinks about the possibilities of different things happening in that mentorship model, and maybe what mentorship looks like this week or this month looks different than next year, right? It uses that inclusive design model. It really supports a trauma-informed practice and trauma-informed principles. There's choice built into it. So how do you want to communicate? How do you want to discuss these things? There's a sense of empowerment that's attached to it. Again, another trauma-informed principle, right? How do we empower mentees to understand the skills and give them the guidance that they need to start a project, to start in a new field, right? Those choice models, that empowerment really can create a community around a mentee. And that's what accessible mentorship is about. Maybe it was a space that they never thought existed or ever didn't know existed. And so now you're giving them that opportunity. So how do we do this? Well, we approach this, number one, with a belief in continuity. Too often, mentorship models are framed around time limits that often don't work for a lot of folk, especially those in the disability community. And so there has to be this belief in continuity. Mentorship models as they exist now often are just like for a couple of months or maybe a term or maybe a year. What would happen if we thought about mentorship models with a belief in continuity, that this is something that can continue going forward, right? And so this means listening to the needs and the expectations of both people that are in this relationship, and listening to that with an open mind, right? What does the mentee need? How are you as the mentor going to provide that, right? What kind of flexibility can you build into that, right? And how can you give some resources in meaningful ways. And when I mean resources, I don't just mean texts or articles or maybe, accessible infographics or any of those kinds of things. Sometimes a resource can be a person, can be a connection. And those resources will change, will have that same flexibility of change as the mentorship model progresses. So what are some next steps if you're really interested in kind of thinking about accessible mentorship? Well, first, you can reflect and think about who do you know that would be open to mentorship, right? Oftentimes, those that would want mentorship don't have access to it. So think about the students, the colleagues, the coworkers, the community members and connections that you know that might benefit from mentorship and put that out there and be like, hey, I'm available for this. How do we make this happen? Then decide on accessible contact methods. And again, this will reflect on who you're mentoring, right? So some will prefer a Zoom meeting, some will prefer in-person meetings if they feel comfortable doing that in an accessible way. Some may prefer phone calls. Again, have those conversations and see how that can happen. Be clear about the time and ask boundaries. So I know, again, we want to approach this with this idea that there might not necessarily be boundaries, but you might have dates where you're busy and you won't be able to connect. Maybe someone needs that, we need to meet every once in a while at this particular time. If that's a thing, then have a conversation and make sure that that's clear for both parties. And ultimately, have a plan for the future. How can the mentees become mentors? This is what we want, right? This is where this idea comes from. Accessible mentorship means having people do accessibility work in the future. And in my case, it's about thinking about who is going to do accessible pedagogical support in the future. What does that look like? So I really thank you for spending time with me today. Here's my website, which is my name, which is Anne Gagne, so ANNGAGNE.ca. I've also provided my email. So the email that I use for accessibility work that I do is accessigogy. So that's ACCESSAGOGY So please feel free to reach out if in any of those ways if you want to continue that conversation. And again, thanks so much for sharing space with me. And let's hope we can move forward to more accessible mentorship in the future. Have a great day.